There is a young man who I got to know, or who I know, whose life came alive in terms of faith just before his last year at school. And one of the implications of that was he actually started working hard for his studies. And every parent of teenagers here says. And the headmaster noticed, called him into the headmaster's study. Headmaster took a look at him and he said, young man, he said, I would like to make you a school prefect. Now, in this school, that was a big deal. It was a few pupils who had a lot of responsibility, who were very looked up to by some of the younger children particularly. Headmaster went on like this. He said, I'm rather concerned about the lack of industry in the prefect's room at this point in time. And he said, I think by putting you there, it will make a huge difference to the way in which they work. Now, one of the things I love about this story is this young man had never thought about the fact that his faith could lead to influencing other people. This young man just simply thought, if you follow Jesus, you're meant to work hard. Nor had it ever crossed his mind that actually he was standing in a long line of men and women who down the centuries have followed Jesus and found that they've influenced others along the way. I mean, if we go back 2 millennia, it was the Christians who would tour these city rubbish dumps, picking off the malformed and unwanted children and bringing them into their homes and raising them as their own. It was uniquely the Christians who argued for the equality of both sexes, giving leadership to women, and inviting the social and the ethnic outcasts of their time right into the heart of their communities. Justin Martyr, the 2nd century apologist, when the emperor was persecuting, he turned round to the emperor and he said, don't kill us. We're your best citizens. Fast forward a millennia and a bit. Luther and the other reformers were the first people to actually argue that education shouldn't be simply the privilege of the children of the rich and wealthy, but that actually something like universal education might be good for everybody. You may not be aware, but the rise of the modern university was largely due to Christian influence. Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Heidelberg, Basel, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all have Christian origins. Some of the great art of the Renaissance and later, pictures by Da Vinci, Tintoretto, Raphael, all men of faith and people for whom the crowds still flock to be influenced. Without Christianity, there'd have been no Mozart, no Mendelssohn, and no Hallelujah Chorus. There would be no Johann Sebastian Bach, and each of his manuscripts at the bottom written to the glory of God. There had been no Elizabeth Fry and the prison reform that she was involved with. No William Wilberforce and his insistence that the slave trade was to end. It was said of Lord Shaftesbury and of Dr. Barnardo that they changed the very idea of what it meant to be a child in Victorian England. It was said that they took it from Charles Dickens, childhood is to be endured, to Peter Pan, childhood is to be enjoyed. Leibniz, Faraday shaped our thinking of physics. Martin Luther King fought for civil rights. Mother Teresa redefined what selfless love was all about in our generation. What I'm trying to say is that people have lived better, longer, more fulfilled lives because of the influence of Christian men and women around them. And of course, naturally, as a result, more men and women have found faith as well. Now, my suspicion is that a few of us here would like to get on that bandwagon. That whether individuals or churches, that we would love to think that because of our faith, we would have influence in our rural communities, our housing estates, our towns, cities, or possibly even larger platforms. But here's my observation, is that for many people of faith, it is hard to get off first base from desire to implementation. And I want to suggest that one key thing for you and I, if we are going to do that, is actually to sync the ideas about mission and life that we have with our deepest beliefs. What I'm trying to say is that ideas are a bit like the tectonic plates that underlie our lives. We don't often think about our ideas, our presuppositions, our preconceptions. They're just there. When they're synced with your sense of calling, when they're aligned with what you want to do, your life shoots forward as a result. When they're out of sync, you tend to stumble, skip, struggle, and go round in circles. So I want to suggest this morning that there's an event that happened in our history centuries ago, which most of us here probably are unaware of, but I would suggest has had significant influence on the shaping of the tectonic plates or ideas in our lives that often means that we long for something that we never quite get to. Let me tell you a story. 1660s. Parliament is determined at long last to settle the question of worship in the Christian church. Being a Protestant parliament, they say, here's how it's going to be. We're going to have the common book of prayer, and anyone who gets to officiate must be recognized by a bishop. The consequence of this was that 2,000 pastors left the church. It was known as the Great Ejection. There were some very good things about that for those that went. For the first time in their lives, they were able to order worship, government, and the life of the church according to their convictions and their conscience. It gave them freedom, but it came at a very significant price. The price was this, and it came in about 5 different acts of parliament, but it essentially meant that if you didn't use the Book of Common Prayer and you didn't acknowledge a bishop, then you were placed on the fringe of society for the next 150 years. It was done like this. You were told that unless you used the Book of Common Prayer, you couldn't teach, nor could you take any sort of public office. No going to Oxford, Cambridge, being involved in the military. You were essentially excluded from society. And that, right at the origins of non-conformity, of those churches that are other than Anglican and Catholic, which of course we would identify with, that right at the origins was an incredibly traumatic event for men and women, finding themselves suddenly in a different place. Now, we all have had traumatic events in our lives. We know what they're like. You carry the emotions of them for years to come, and unless you're careful, they shape your future identity. I was reminded of this week in an unusual moment of pastoral faux pas for me. To give you the context, in my church, there are more children being born right now than any sane person can possibly keep track with. One father-to-be was recently explaining to me how he and his wife really hoped that the birth of this next child would not be a cesarean section. I looked at him and said, well, your first one wasn't, was it? He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said it all. It said, how could you possibly have forgotten? The emotion was clearly still with him. The fear at a future event because of a past event was vivid. It's what happens with traumatic events. And I want to suggest that in the trauma of this event, what happens also with traumatic events is you rationalize, or if you're Christian, you theologize your situation. Because you've got to answer, what am I doing here? And I want to suggest 4 things which now tie down the sleeping giant of the church, which either got in then or subsequently. Let me just mention them very briefly. The first is a certain suspicion of society, culture, and institutions. I mean, wouldn't you if you'd just been kicked out of the whole thing? An understanding of mission which is essentially raid and retreat. A speaking to society which means have the boldness to proclaim, but don't even ask whether anybody is listening. You're simply too far away to hope for that. A conviction that to bring change is all about as many personal hearts as possible. In other words, it's all bottom up. Well, if you're excluded from the centre, it has to be, doesn't it? As I've been thinking about this, the image in my mind is that of Gulliver on his travels, tied down by the Lilliputians. Little strings, but between them keeping him captive, and a sleeping giant who's held by these sorts of ideas. How then should we respond? Let's just look very quickly at some responses to those four things. Suspicion of society. Maybe it's better to say that it's good, but we should take a positive but critical approach. Good gift, something wonderful that God has made, given to us, but to be wary for any time that the good becomes the ultimate, we remember its fallen nature. I think people often get confused about the term the world in the New Testament. And we often think the world is everything outside this room. We forget that the world is actually more to do with anything that sets itself up independent of God. Consequently, we realize the world is in here rather than out there. Mission, dawn raids and retreats, or living amongst those who you're seeking to serve. I love the way Eugene Peterson puts it in the message. The word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. In other words, we're not thinking about parallel cultures or institutions for our experiences. They only prove to be less good equivalents of what's already being done. We're thinking incarnation, living amongst those you live. Proclaim to society? Well, surely persuasion rather than proclamation is the goal. And if I want to persuade you of something, I need your heart before I get your head. I need to build trust before I persuade you of my ideas. I want to suggest that speaking wherever possible is best done with relationship and in private. Though there are times where maybe we'll get to talk about that later today. To bring about change, anyone who looks at change understands that people movements are great, but that people at the point of cultural production seem to have disproportionate degrees of influence. In other words, it's top down and bottom up. As one person put it, it's stalactite and stalagmite. And when they join together, geologists say those rock formations are some of the strongest rock formations around. It's my suggestion that if we can loosen these ties, the sleeping giant might arise. I want to suggest that we should realize the need to follow in the footsteps of Jesus on his journey from the edge to the center. That just as Jesus left Galilee, moved towards Jerusalem only to be crucified on the edge of the center, just outside the city walls, that maybe many of us are being asked to do the same in our communities, businesses, whatever your realm is. On the fringe of society simply means you're too far away. On the edge of the people that you're meant to be reaching simply means that you're too far away to have influence. To be right at the center leads you to get so invested in the status quo, it's hard to bring about change. Most change happens at the edge of the center. And I want to suggest that that is where we should position ourselves. Let me just show you, in closing, how this can work. Southampton City Council, a few years ago now, facing severe budget cuts, called community and church leaders together to ask, is there any way you can help us share the load so we can serve this city in the way that we want to? Church leaders who loved the world that God had placed them in, decided they weren't too busy to attend that meeting. The result of it was that they called 21 days of prayer and reflection, after which they responded to the city council. They said, you know those 80 foster children that you said we have no other resource for caring for them? The church in Southampton said, we will take 50% of them, 40 children. Not only did they do that, but they produced this piece of artwork, 40 keys to symbolize 40 homes, with Psalm 68 verse 6. God puts the lonely in families. It's hanging even now on the walls of Southampton City Social Services. The result, or the latest count that I've heard at least, is that not only have 40 children found care, but now 75 out of those 80 homes have been provided by the church. I'm saying literally, single-handedly, the church have solved the problem of what you do with children who have neither homes nor parents in that area. But that is not all that they did, although that sounds to me a pretty incarnational way of doing mission, doesn't it? Having one of those in the bedroom next to yours. Didn't stop there. They also increased the number of sessions for youth drop-in centres. They increased the output and help for families. Street pastors have been working in some of the more troubled communities for 4 years now. 5 Healing on the Streets teams are working in different suburbs. There's a pregnancy counselling service, a number of food banks, a clothes provision outlet, meals for the homeless, 2 new Oasis academies, and next autumn, a new free primary school. All done by people of faith. All of these have provided opportunities for them to speak. Not from across a wide divide, but up close and personal, with people who are becoming friends and, guess what, therefore inclined to hear what they say. Billy Kennedy, who I know you know, tells me that the result is they've been invited to sit on a number of boards and are consequently becoming embedded in the structural life of the city, where key decisions are being made, so that to complement now the work on the ground is work from above, stalactite, stalagmite, working together. It's the power of working from the edge of the centre, a position where if we want to be game changers, I would suggest we're invited to occupy, that will result in our contribution to the flourishing of communities and of the nation that we love, and of course God loves so much more. Thank you very much.